So I'm going to talk a little bit about reproducibility and open software practices in climate research. So I thought I'd start by just talking about myself, basically, because that's the easy bit. So for a long time, I was a researcher. So what I did is I developed global models of particulate matter, particularly the global model called GLOMAP, which I helped to develop during my PhD based at the University of Leeds. And what we did with the model is we realised that particulate matter wasn't treated very well in global models, so we built a new way of treating it. So kind of quite maths heavy, kind of realising there was a gap in the science, and we tried to address that. And that's what I did during my PhD. And it was a really long time. Those of you that have done model development know that it takes a really long time to develop a model. And the time from thinking, oh, we should develop a model to the first paper was a lot of years. But we got our first paper out in 2005. And this is the first ever GLOMAP paper simulation. This is sulfur dioxide concentration. Those of you that are used to looking at modelling output will notice it's quite a low resolution. It's also the monthly mean concentration because the model was so expensive we couldn't run it for a full year. So we were very proud of it, but it feels like a really long time ago. The world has moved on a lot since then. Our modelling ability and our capability has moved on since then. So after kind of working at Leeds and doing the GLOMAP model, I moved to Met Office for a little while, I moved to Germany, went to the Max Planck Institute. I came back to Leeds and I got a new job where I was kind of the person that fixes the model, the person that helps other people put parameterizations into the model, the person that ports the model to different supercomputing structures. I had the great job title of model domain expert, which is much better than research software engineer. But effectively I was a research software engineer, an embedded research software engineer that was working with one or two specific models. And through that, I got to know the research software engineering community. And I was kind of reflecting on my experiences of open research and reproducibility, and I'd love to be able to say that we led the way in this. And I absolutely didn't. I think I'm quite late to the party in this, because when we published this paper, we didn't publish the code that we'd used to develop it. We didn't publish the analysis code that we'd used. We just published our results. And that was what was normal then. We didn't know how to do it. It wasn't expected. It wasn't asked of us. And it was just like an extra thing to do that we didn't even think about. But by having the opportunity to work with the research software engineering community, what I've done is I've learned loads from my research. I've never been trained as a software engineer or anything like that, but I have learned loads from speaking to people that do know about research software engineering, and they've really kind of taught me about open research and why it's so important. And then from them, I got to know the Software Sustainability Institute. For those of you that don't know, the Software Sustainability Institute really campaigns for the importance of software in research. So they recognise that software is really, really important to research. And many researchers like me haven't been trained in software, so they don't necessarily have good software practices. And this slows down research. If you have better software, you have better research. It makes research much more efficient if you adopt good software practices. And that's what the Software Sustainability campaigns for. Speak about. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about reproducibility and why reproducibility is important for climate science. The first thing to say is there's a few different words around this which are all kind of similar and different. It means slightly different things. This illustration is taken from the Turing Way. If you don't know the Turing Way, then the one thing from this talk is go and look at the Turing Way because it's really, really good. They've got funky little graphics as well, so they're nice to use in talks. But they talk about reproducible research, and it's kind of a community initiative which is kind of developed to inform the community, kind of voices from the community coming in to inform the wider community about reproducible research. So this is what I'm going to talk about here, the reproducibility, which is the notion that if you take the same data and you do the same analysis, you should get the same answer, which is a pretty simple, complex concept, really. There's other concepts as well. Replicable research, which they define as if you've got different data but the same analysis. If it's replicable, you'll get the same answer. Then we have robustness, which is the same data, different analysis, same answer. And generalizable is where you've got different data and different analysis. So I should say this is the Turing Way's definition. If you Google it, there are a few kind of subtle distinctions between what people use, but I like the clarity with which they've defined this. So today I'm going to really focus on reproducibility. And for the findings of a study to be reproducible, what it means is the results obtained by an experiment or an observational study or in a statistical analysis of a data set should be achieved again with a high degree of reliability when the study is repeated. So it's kind of what you learn in school, that it's a science experiment. If you do it twice, you should get the same answer. And in some fields, reproducibility is very challenging because, for example, you might be working in a lab where external conditions really affect the results of your experiment, and those need to be controlled for. But in software, we should have an advantage. Software should be quite easy to do reproducible research. But reproducibility and the question of reproducibility isn't just related to software research. In fact, there's kind of this notion that actually reproducibility across all of research is something that's not really focused on. People don't take it that seriously, yet it's really important. It's fundamental to the scientific method. It builds trust and credibility. Reproducibility is really important in terms of how you detect errors. If something's not reproducible, then that's a big clue that perhaps something's wrong and you should dig into it a bit more. Especially in our field, we're using our data and our science to inform policy and mitigation strategies. And if people are making decisions based on our results and our analysis, then it should be reproducible. And then the thing that I bang on about a lot is the public engagement and understanding. A lot of our research is publicly funded or for the public good. If we're open about it, if we kind of show how reproducible it is, it builds trust in terms of public engagement. But as I say, it's not the focus of much attention, really. There was this nice paper back in 2016 where they asked 1,500 scientists, and they said, is there a reproducibility crisis in science? And 52% said, yes, there's a significant crisis. What was it? 38 said there's a slight crisis, which is a bit of an oxymoron, but we'll go with it. And then very, very few said there's no crisis at all. So about 10% either didn't know or said there was no crisis. And this is because reproducibility isn't really the focus of a lot of people's research. So people are under so much pressure to publish and to do things, the science that they want to do. Not everybody takes the time to think about the reproducibility element of it. So moving back to software, there's different ways we can think of reproducibility, and like many things, you can think of it as a bit of a spectrum. So my day with my global paper, what I did is I just published the results. So it was not reproducible at all. What I could have done is also published the code, the analysis code that we'd used, or the model code. Not in a format that someone else could have run, but at least they could have looked at it and seen, oh, they've done this, they've done that. The next big step is to do code plus data. And then finally, what is ideal in terms of the gold standard of reproducibility is to publish not just the code and the data, but a fully linked and executable version of the tools that you've used to. And then someone can take it up, pick it up, rerun it, and then they can understand what you've done. And you can't really talk about reproducibility without talking about openness. As you move along that reproducibility spectrum, what you're essentially doing is moving along the openness spectrum. So when we were publishing our data, we didn't think of it in this way, but it was essentially closed. No one else could look at the analysis we'd done. No one else could look at the tools we'd used. We had a closed publication. And so as you're moving to make it more reproducible, what you're doing is you're opening up your research. And so there's still kind of quite a lot of misunderstanding about what we mean by open research, and some of the kind of culture changes around that are coming along with increasingly opening up research are quite slow to take effect. So there's this nice paper which has looked at the effect of a policy change in the journal Science. So in 2011, Science changed its policy. They said, if you want to publish with us, we require that all the code and all the data used is put in a publicly accessible repository. And after publication, all reasonable requests must be fulfilled. So they said, they're a really high impact journal. They said, right, we want people to make the data and the code publicly available, please, if you want to publish with us. And so someone came along and studied the effect of this policy change to see whether the community had really got on board, to see whether they'd actually taken this up. So what they did is they looked at 204 computational articles in the year 2011 to 2012. And they found that of those articles, about 24 already had all the code and the analysis and stuff that you could need. Fine. And then they emailed the remaining 180 authors requesting the data and the code they used to generalize results. And they got out, as you can probably imagine, quite a range of different answers. So of the original 204, 12% had sufficient information in the paper, 31% shared their data and code, 22% didn't even respond, and 34% didn't share their data. So this is a journal that the authors have signed up. They've agreed to this condition in terms of publication. And even then, more than half didn't respond or share. So the authors of this paper made the comment as well that says even those that did share, often the shared version of the code wasn't actually the same version as was used to do the analysis. So as a software engineer, you're kind of probably like, oh, of course you would do that. But actually, academics, often they publish and then they move on and then the code base changes and you don't necessarily have a good track record, a good versioning of the code that you've used to publish the data. So even those that were willing to share actually didn't do in a way that was useful or particularly useful. And then they got a range of negative responses, and with like complete understatement, they said that the authors of this paper said there's a fundamental misunderstanding of what the open guidelines were. I mean, I think some of these are just plain rude. One of them is quite typical. We just said, no, we don't share our code. The other one said the code is not very user-friendly, and that's a huge thing. People look at their code and it's a bit of a spider's web, and they've not commented it very well. And they're ashamed to share. They're a bit embarrassed to kind of open this up. And this is where it kind of comes to openness. You worked so long on this, and you know it's right. You wouldn't publish it if you didn't think it was a good representation. You're a bit embarrassed about how poorly it's commented or your if statements or whatever. And then the last two are, as I say, you know, you better explain who you are, who you work for, why you need the data. Ask your supervisor to send me an email, which is the ultimate. So my colleague Rachel Ainsworth at the SSI, she does a talk about reproducibility and openness, and she has the angle about talking about kindness in science and why it's important to be kind in terms of developing collaboration, in terms of making it a really kind of safe and pleasant environment to work in, because apart from anything else, increases the rate at which science can be done if we're kind to each other. So it just made me kind of think of Rachel and her kindness, because, I mean, in terms of how you respond to requests for openness, that's really important. So why don't people share? We all know we should. Why don't people do it? There's lots of barriers to open research. There's a lack of awareness and training. Very few courses on like opening research or reproducibility, and it's lovely to see the focus on it here today, but it's not something that's covered very well. Requires additional skills. This is something that if you're a research software engineer or you're someone that's good at software, you might not see it as a barrier, but as a researcher that's not that great with the technical side of things, it's an extra burden. You've learned to run the code, you've learned how to do Python. It's an extra thing to learn. It requires additional skills to do it, and to do it correctly as well. There's obviously a publication bias towards novel findings, so it's not the focus of a lot of people's research. There's a perceived lack of reward. I should say I took this from Kirsty Whitaker from the Turing Way, and at first I kind of thought, perceived lack of reward? There is a lack of reward. But then I looked into it a little bit more, and there is some initial studies that show the more open your research is, the more cited you are. So you're likely to get a more citable, slightly higher impact paper if you take the open research approach, because it's something you create. So if you create a DOI and then people can cite you, then you're going to get cited more. It's not considered for promotion. Again, you can talk about RSEs and career paths and things like that, but in general, it's not something that's really taken that seriously by academia, so it's not something that you would necessarily put in your promotion criteria, perhaps, over time. And then the big one is it takes time. You know, we've all too much to do. And this kind of goes back to Rachel's in terms of kindness. I think there's a real fear that if you share, people might find mistakes, which is not a reason not to share, because you want to know if there's a mistake, because you want to be able to fix it. But the uncomfortableness of opening up something that you've been working on in your little group to the wider public is quite an uncomfortable, or it can be quite an uncomfortable sensation. So we as a culture need to make sure that it's okay to be human. It's okay to say, this is my code. Someone comes along, finds a bug, you fix it, you check to see whether it makes any difference to your results. That's part of the scientific process. And it is essential for climate science. Like, I've been working in this field for a really long time, and when I started, I kind of thought the more information we gather, then we'll be able to kind of present it to policymakers, and then action will happen and all this kind of stuff. But unfortunately, 20 years later, we're still working in a field that's controversial. We're still around Twitter with climate deniers and people that think, oh yeah, maybe the climate's changing, but it's not us, or it's not going to change fast. So we're still working in a field that's quite controversial, and because of that, we need to make sure that we act in a way that's above reproach in every way possible, and that is opening up your research and increasing your reproducibility. So this is the climate stripes, which were just recently projected onto the White Cliffs of Dover for Show Your Stripes Day. It's a lovely example of science and art and public engagement, but it also just highlights how controversial things are still. So what can we do about reproducibility? If you want to, hopefully, want to make your work reproducible and open, how can we do that? And there's a pile of tools that you can use, basically. I'm going to skip over these fairly quickly because I'm sure that most people know them fairly well. But basically, in this reproducibility spectrum, you've got a lot of different tools you could use. Version control, you've got GitHub, Bitbucket, GitLab. They're relatively recent tools, or at least they're relatively recent in terms of being commonly used, but they're so useful in terms of version control, in terms of sharing code. We use GitHub for project management as well. It's really handy for that. But there are tools where you can keep your code and share your code. And then the next step is to produce your code and your data. And one thing you can do with this is you can make your code citable. So just because it's in GitHub doesn't mean that it's citable. It means that you've got a version, you can send the version to your collaborator, and that's brilliant. But it's not a permanent record in the way that something that needs to be if it's going to be citable. So something like Zenodo, if you upload something to Zenodo, what it does is it gives you a DOI. And a DOI is a permanent record that you can cite forever. So had I done that with my little GLOMAP paper, I could have archived it in Zenodo, had Zenodo existed at the time, and then I could have linked to the GitHub version. So you could have asked me what code you use, and of course I wouldn't remember it because it's a long time ago, but I would have been able to look it up. And other people would have been able to cite it, which makes it more open, and it does increase your profile in terms of the people using it because they're able to cite your research. In terms of promotion in universities and things like that, they understand citations. And then the final step, which I have to say I'm slow to embrace and not quite there in terms of the technical side, is making it making it usable. So this is kind of linking the full workflow together using something like Binder or Docker or Singularity, which has obvious advantages because you can just unpack it. So what can you do? What kind of tools you can do for linked and executable code and data? There's loads. Jupyter notebooks are really good. I have a PhD student who uses Jupyter notebooks. It's brilliant because you can just send me the notebook and I can look down at her analysis and we can package all that up together. I can run it on my machine, she runs it on hers. Docker and Singularity are containers, so they're used to package the entire scientific workflow. And then Binder launches a Git repository. So the one thing I wanted to say about this is, I'm sure there's a lot of people in this room that regularly use these tools. So I don't want to say anything more about why they're important or why they're useful. But one thing I have learned more than anything else and more than any training course I've ever been on is watching other people use tools and learning from them. And it's such a huge part, if you're a research software engineer, it's a huge part of the benefit of being a research software engineer is that you probably not even aware of it, but other people learn by watching you do stuff well. And again, it's probably not going to go into your promotion criteria, but it's so important. So if you demonstrate the use of these tools, if you show, look, I've used this, and not only have I done this work, I've packaged it up and it's in this executable form, and then there'll be academics who are less technical and less confident with the engineering side of things that are looking over your shoulder going, oh, they did that, that's really cool, I wish I knew how to do that. And learning by inspiring others, this is the right way to do things is really, really important. And there are people that want to learn these skills that might not be persuaded to go on a course or a workbook until they've seen the value of them. And so by showing the value, showing them in use, you kind of show the value of them, which I think is really, really important. So this is a really long list, sorry, too many words in the slide, but there's a really nice paper which is called Challenge to Scientists, Does Your 10-Year-Old Code Still Run? Which in my case is no, definitely not. But in the future when I write code, I'm hoping that in 10 years' time my code will still run because I've adopted a lot of these practices and I've really learned by doing. So these are things, I'm going to whiz through them quite quickly because I know they're things that you probably do quite regularly. So how do you maximize the likelihood of reproducibility? Use code, you don't use Excel spreadsheets, no point and click kind of stuff. I think we're all there. Documentation, so comments, computation notebooks, README files, so important. You kind of imagine your future self will remember what your present self is doing. My future self is not that great at remembering. So make a record of things, again, in terms of remembering key parameters, like if you're using a random seed or something like that. Test, create a suite of test functions. Now, this is something I've really struggled to do. I've learned a little bit from working with research software engineers. It feels designing appropriate tests for something as messy as climate data and climate modelling I find really, really challenging. So I'm just going to skip over it and hope that no one asks. Guide, write a master script, so for example, a run file. Again, that's something I've learned to do from research software engineers. Archive it. So this is what I was saying. So GitHub isn't permanent in the way you would like it to be. So use an archiving service like Zenodo. That gives you a DII and it gives you permanence and citability. Track, version control. I'm sure everyone in this room uses version control. So note which version you use to create each result. So this is going back to the people that shared their code but couldn't remember which version they'd actually done their paper with. You need to be able to provide that information. Package, so this is your containerized tools, which I'm working on, I'm learning about. Automation, using continuous integration services to automatically test your code over time. Simplify, this is a bit of a niche one, but it's probably important in terms of avoiding kind of third-party libraries that can complicate it, and niche ones that are hard to install because they'll make it harder in the future. And then verify, so check your code's portability by running it in a range of computer environments, which is fine if you've got nice, simple code, but not that easy to do with the climate model. But it is part of the process. So before I move on to the kind of more climatey part of the talk, I wanted to talk a little bit about the fair data principles. It's something that you guys are probably very familiar with. The notion of fair data is really to, particularly in environmental data, I have to say, I'm not sure whether other fields are as bad as us, but I've worked with environmental data sets where the same thing, like sulfur dioxide, is called like 10 different things by different people. You know, there's so many different ways of spelling it. You can put some underscores in there. There's no consistency. There's no consistency. I've definitely worked with data where you've got the data and then the units are in a different file, or the units are available on request from the authors. It's so messy because it takes a long time to go into the field and measure data, and it's really important. But there's very little coordination of the people going into the field and measuring data in terms of how they report their data. So these fair data guidelines are really helpful and they're really important. The idea is to enhance the ability of machines to automatically find and use the data, which has the added effect of making it easier for people as well. But loads and loads of environmental data is not reused. It's used, it's taken, and maybe you write a publication on it, and then it's stored, and nobody ever uses it again. When it comes to evaluating models, we want every bit of data we can find. But that means, and I've worked in projects that do this, where you have to go and you scan through the literature, you think, oh, that number here, you email the author, you get that, you know, an Excel spreadsheet which has got that data in it, and then you email a different author. It takes such a lot of time. It's a huge amount of human time that we spend kind of trying to access data that should just be available and in a format that we can easily use. Just to say, fair data is kind of a spectrum. It's not binary. You can make it more fair. There's lots of kind of horrible corruptions to the word fair. Kind of make it kind of fairish and fairable and all that stuff. But it's a kind of pathway to move along that if there are guidelines to follow, and the more you follow them, the more fair your data will be. There's a really good website that's got loads of information on it. So the Fair for Data came along in about 2016, and you know what data can do, research software can do, you know, better even. So then Fair for Research Software came along. So Fair for Research Software is a really interesting project. It was developed as a huge community engagement idea. So what they did is they held a series of workshops across the world of people interested in research software, and they basically said, you know, look, Fair is really improving what we can do, how we manage environment, or how we manage any kind of research data. What can we do in terms of research software? Can we take these principles and adapt them to make them suitable for research software? The answer, of course, is yes, they did. They've got the same acronyms, so you've got the same findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. You've got similar principles. You've got very detailed adoption guidelines. So I was in two minds as to whether to go through them all in detail, but actually I decided not to because I think it's more interesting to kind of it's more useful, basically, to just go and read them yourself. But they are quite clear. So they've got things like version control and citation, things like that. But they've also got quite a lot of things which maybe you wouldn't have thought of. So, but I mean, it was a huge community effort. So it was developed by the community for the community. So they are very appropriate. They know the research software community quite well. So they are achievable, I think, is the important thing. So moving on to kind of climate modelling. I've talked a lot about stuff that's quite general in terms of the openness of science and why it's important to be open in science. And I hope you understand kind of the motivation for being open, particularly in climate science. But then it kind of comes to the challenges of being open in climate science. I mean, what can we do in terms of opening up our research? And one of the biggest challenges is that climate science is really, really complicated. What we're doing with a climate model is we're taking a representation of a really, really complex system, and we're trying to represent it in computer code. That's not a simple thing to do. It's something that if you work with it every day, you kind of get used to it. So this, I love this animation, it's great. It's a false color image from NASA. It's particulate matter aerosol. So they false colored it by the composition of the aerosol. So you've got sea spray aerosol here, where you've got high winds. The higher the winds, the bigger the waves, the more sea spray comes up. You've got green, you've got biomass burning aerosol. So this is the kind of land clearing and a bit of wildfires coming across. That's dust, obviously, from the Sahara. And then you've got white aerosol here, which is sulfate aerosol. So that's largely produced by industrial pollution. If you keep an eye here, you'll see a volcano explode in a couple of seconds. It's also produced by volcanic activity. Yay, there we go. So I love this animation partly because it just shows the complexity. So I'm interested in particulate matter. That's the thing that I do. That's the thing that I look at. But there's other people that are interested in the ocean dynamics of this, the weather patterns, the removal, and they're not independent. In my day, GLOMAP was just an atmospheric model. It just did the atmosphere. We didn't even calculate the winds. We read in the winds. Whereas now you've got Earth system models that are calculating the winds. They've got land-ocean interactions. If it gets hotter, there's more biomass burning because there's more forest fires. The volcanoes have an effect. It's a really complex system. And it's not something, a computer model that represents all this complication. You can't stick it in a Jupyter notebook. It's not something that's really easy to version control. The Met Office Unified Model has more than 2 million lines of code. Nobody has oversight over all of that. It's not possible. So we as a community need to work together, if we're working with such a complex model, to work out how we can work together, how we can be open so we can understand all the complexity that we need to represent this really complex system. So what can we do about it? How can we be more open? The first thing, really obvious but important step, is to create a common language. So when I go back to kind of using observations, when I said there's lots of different ways of spelling the same species, it's so true. There's loads and loads of different, every model has a different name for kind of black matter, black carbon aerosol. So what the CF metadata conventions are, is they try and, well, they have created conventions to name important climate and weather forecasting data output. It's really, really interesting to do. And it just makes it much easier to share data, to understand what data is. The nice thing they do, they use NetCDF format and they integrate the metadata into the file, which if you're used to it, you think, of course. But actually it's quite a new thing. And so the file is self-describing. You don't have to go and email the author and ask what they were doing. All the data is available to you within the file, which you imagine if you're, so with a global model, what we've done quite a lot is we've had to, if you work in one particular area, you're maybe just interested in observations from one place. If you're working in a global model, what you're doing is you're taking in observations from loads of different field campaigns that are all looking at different things, have their own different conventions. So you're having to convert the naming conventions from these specific groups' naming conventions by yourself. And it's not easy because they're not always self-descriptive. So if people use the shared and common language, it makes it much easier. So we can ingest the information into our model, and it's trivially easy compared to the mess that it can be. So the CF Python, and it's essentially making environmental data more fair. As a wee plug for CEDA, because if anyone of you have ever spoken to CEDA about how to kind of manage your environmental data set, they're really, really helpful, and they're tons of knowledge and information. So don't feel nervous to approach them, because I find them really, really helpful. So moving on, the other thing, the kind of next kind of gold standard in terms of what to do, how to make our science more accessible is to use a community model. I Googled this because I kind of had no idea of how many environmental community models there are. This is not a comprehensive list. This is the list I could find on the train down here when I was Googling it. They're all American, I think. I don't know, I can't think of a European one. Nemo's maybe not. Okay. There's certainly more American ones than European ones. I assume that's something to do with the funding conditions. But actually, I mean, in our group, we've used WRF and WRF Chem a lot. We've used GS5. And we've used them partly because they're available. You don't need to develop your own model. If someone else has developed for you and they've taken the time to maintain it and to provide good versions of the model, then why would you try and develop your own? It took us 10 years to develop GLOMAP. Or you could download a model that someone else has written and that they maintain. And so that's a huge, I don't know how much else to say about it, but it's such an important thing to make the model, if you can, obviously there's politics involved, to make the model that you use open source and as open as possible. So I wanted to do a wee bit of science as well. And one of the things in terms of open research is, what's uncomfortable is when you write a model, when you write the code that you develop, you spend a lot of time doing it. You try and do the best representation as you can of a very complex physical system. And it's a bit, you don't always know how it's going to behave under certain conditions because it's a model. It's there to kind of represent something that you can't calculate in your head. And so it's quite an uncomfortable process of bringing your model along and comparing it to other models. But modeling into comparison projects are a fabulous example of open science because what they do is they ask models to run a series of standardized experiments. So everybody runs the same experiment with their model and you can compare the answers. And there's always that terrifying bit when you first see your model compared to everyone else's and you wonder whether it's like way higher or way lower, and if it's in the middle you're like, oh, it can't be that wrong. But it's really, really important because that is how you understand differences between the models, and that's how you understand your own model because it forces you to look at your own model in a different light. If your wet deposition parameterization is faster than everyone else's, you're like, is that realistic or is that just the way I've coded it? It really forces you to kind of to dig into the information. So this is just aerosol absorption in global models. So what you can see from this, you've got, 15 models? You can see the range. So you've got this one high, which is relatively high, much lower aerosol absorption. And what that can tell you as a scientist as well is it tells you the degree of uncertainty. So it's not a full estimate of the uncertainty because models are not truly independent from each other. Because a lot of the models, although someone else might have coded up the same parameterizations, a lot of them use the same parameterizations for the same processes. So it's not a true estimate of the full uncertainty, but it is an indication of the structural uncertainty. So how much this output depends on just how you structure a global model. So the range of responses basically, it gives you an idea of the robustness of the findings and the sensitivity to parameterizations, and it gives you a clue as to what to look at as a model developer. It gives you a clue of the uncertainty and also where you should be focusing your attention. So the other thing that I've worked on quite a lot is kind of parametric uncertainty in models, and this comes into openness on the basis that in a climate model, we like to think that we're representing the world as well as we can. It's basically where we are. But we know there's things in our parameterizations, in our representations, which can't be known exactly. So for example, in my model, we have sea spray aerosol, like in the animation. You've got a higher wind speed, you've got more sea spray. And we know that sea spray is related to wind speed. That's fine, it makes sense. What we don't know is we don't know the slope of that relationship. It could be quite steep, could be shallower. That is a genuine uncertainty. We just don't know that. People go and sail ships around really stormy oceans and try and measure it, which is nice of them, but we don't know it that precisely. So we know when we're running our model, what we do is we kind of choose our best estimate. But we know there's an uncertainty associated with that. And that doesn't matter. The uncertainty doesn't matter. That uncertainty only matters if it affects our model results, if it affects our prediction of climate. If I'm looking at aerosol for health benefits, for example, for health effects of aerosol in Europe, really doesn't matter how much sea spray there is in the Southern Ocean. But if I'm looking at climate, perhaps it does, because I'm looking at the change over time, and natural aerosols are actually really important in terms of climate baseline. So what we need to do is not just think about the uncertainties in our model, but think about whether the uncertainty is relevant. And in terms of openness, it's really important because I think, partly because it's really boring, what choice of parameter to use in your sea spray function, it's not something that you kind of present at a conference, but it's also something that people aren't that willing to talk about because it's the bits of the model that they're not sure about. So they will give endless talks to the bits of the model they are sure about and they're confident about. but we've all got bits in the model that we're less confident about because they're just not known, and so we've had to make some assumptions. So we did some work, this is work largely led by Ken Carswell at Leeds, who, looking into uncertain parameters, and parametric uncertainty is something that people use perturbed physics ensembles for lots of different reasons. Now, if you're new to science, you'll hear the words perturbed physics ensemble come up a lot. I wanted to include this in terms of just kind of the motivation as to why you'd want to do it. So different parameter settings produce different results and different sensitivities. So think about the sea spray. Is it high? Is it low? That's going to produce, if you run the model twice, if you run it once with high, once with low, your model output will be different. So you have a different scenario. So what you can do with the perturbed physics ensemble is basically you can test the sensitivity to the uncertain parameters in your model. And unfortunately, there's not just one or two uncertain parameters in the model, there's probably 20 or 30. So what you can do is you can build a parameter space where you're running the model multiple times with different values of your unknown parameters. And what you get is you get this kind of uncertainty space here, and the wee dots inside it are model simulations. So they are your model truth within this uncertainty space. So you know if you set your C-spray function relationship to 2, for example, you might end up with a dot down here. If you set it to 3, you might end up with a dot up here. So what you do is you're trying to space fill an uncertain parameter space by using different values of the uncertain parameters in your model. But obviously this is quite dotty and you don't know anything about what's happening in between. And then you can use a statistical emulator. So we use a Bayesian process emulator. What it does is it space fills between the known parameters. So what you're doing is you're creating, like, to run this, you maybe do a couple of 100 model runs. Then your statistical emulator is space filling. So it moves from like a couple of 100 model runs to maybe 1,000 model runs, but they're emulator runs. So it's the emulator kind of expecting what the model would do within that parameter space. And you can test whether your emulator is right by running a few extra model runs and seeing whether your emulator is doing a good job. But in terms of like the psychology of it, what's really important is, I think, is that you kind of imagine that you run the model once, you get one answer. But if you run the model lots of times, you get lots of answers. So your prediction of what's there actually has an uncertainty associated with it. So if I'm interested in aerosol concentration somewhere, I don't know, like in Paris, for example, instead of having a single value from my model, I've actually got a PDF. And this reflects the uncertainty in my model from the unknown parameterizations. And the magic of using an emulator is you can do variance analysis, and that kind of tells you which of the parameters is contributing most to your uncertainty. So for example, it's a poor example, you can't read any of them. In this one, if I was looking at Paris, sea spray aerosol would be tiny because it doesn't matter. But if I was looking at the aerosol concentration in the Southern Ocean, sea spray aerosol would be big because it's telling me that sea spray aerosol is important in this region. It's a really good tool for opening up the kind of awkward bits of the model that we don't like to think about and making them the focus of research and really forcing us to understand the uncertainty within our models. The other thing you can do is you can compare to observations. So you take your perturbed physics ensemble and you compare it to observations, and this is where you need an absolute ton of observations, ideally held in CF compliant format because you can just quickly read them in, or you can do like I did and spend 6 months of your life trying to get them in a common format, and you can just reject all the implausible models. And there's a big pile of statistical stuff about how you reject stuff, because maybe if your model's totally wrong, it's not parametric uncertainty, maybe your model's just wrong. But anyway, you can kind of reject the implausible models, and what you end up with is a constrained model. So you end up with a model where it's just using model simulations from parameter settings that are, in terms of comparison to the observations, reasonable. So you end up with a greater degree of confidence in the model. So, I mean, I'm very aerosol particulate matter focused, but you can use aerosol model into comparison projects and perturbed physics ensembles. They're really becoming to be really, really common tools throughout all of climate science. We're kind of moving away from the idea that you run the model once, this is your answer. Actually, you need to check how sensitive your answer is to the assumptions that you've made in your model. And perturbed physics ensembles are a pain because you need to run your model lots and lots of times, but they're a really, really good tool in terms of exploring and understanding parameter space. So the other thing I wanted to talk a little bit about is in terms of environmental data and openness environmental data. I wanted to show an example of why open environmental data is cool. This is from OpenAQ, which is an initiative which is trying to make air quality data accessible. Air quality data is really an interesting example because so many people are interested in air quality in their local area, in their local neighbourhood. So they want to be able to look up what the air quality is like. It's a really nice kind of, A, it's public engagement, but B, what they've done is they've put the data in a common format, in a common platform, so you can download it. So it's trivially easy, really, if you know what you're doing in terms of software, download all this data, and then you can compare it to your model, as opposed to like the more opaque measurements which aren't held in a single common format. But the other thing that's really noticeable for this data, the thing that is frankly quite depressing, is if you look at the distribution of where air quality data is, it's not where you have poor air quality, it's where you have money to buy sensors. So you've got tend to have very high air quality in this area. There's very few publicly available sensors. Tend to have quite high air quality, quite poor air quality over here as well. Very few sensors. You've got these massive data gaps. Some of it's about sharing data. I mean, China does have data, it's just not sharing it. But a lot of it is about a bias into where these sensors are placed. And this is it's so important. The sensors, in terms of particulate matter, in particular, because they're placed for public interest, they're not placed where scientifically we need them, particularly. They're placed where people have the availability of funds and the infrastructure to put sensors. So there's huge bias, which doesn't help science. And it also doesn't help the people living in those areas. And so this is kind of brings me on to the idea of openness for social justice. And it's not a topic that I'm particularly comfortable speaking about, but it's something that's really important. I think when we work with climate models, when we look at climate predictions, and the scientist in me is like, oh gosh, it's going to get really hot there. But the human in me thinks, well, there's a human effect of that. These are not just kind of simulations, and day to day you think of them as simulations because otherwise you go crazy. But climate change is a global issue, and it's easy for people to kind of think of it almost like an academic issue if you work with it really closely. In reality, the population that are most likely to be affected by climate change are least likely to be able to access data around climate change, and that's really, really important. So I didn't know this. This is another thing I learned recently. So the right to access science and its benefits was set out in 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And he took a lot of this thing. There's a really interesting blog from this person at UNESCO, and they claim that 60% of the research articles published over the last decade on the topic of climate change are behind paywalls. I think that's probably lessened in the last 4 or 5 years, but it's pretty significant. So people that are living in the global south are much less likely to be able to access this data. So even though they're potentially more affected by climate change, they're less likely to be able to access data about climate change, either because the data is not there, because it's not being measured, or because the data is being held behind paywalls. And they make the point that during the COVID-19 pandemic, people came together, people saw a crisis, and they were like, gosh, what do we do about this? And the scientific community, I mean, they reacted brilliantly, that's fantastic. But they came together and they made an effort to make the data that they're publishing open access. So for the COVID data, 85% of the COVID-related articles are open access. So this blog makes the point saying that we can react to the crisis, but the question becomes whose crisis? If it's our crisis, we kind of come together and make everything public available. But it's a global crisis, so it's something that we do need to make sure is open. I don't know where my 222 comes from. So the point is not only is it unfair, but it's also inefficient. It holds back a scientific process. So morally, whatever, but it's also, what you're doing is you're excluding quite a lot of people from the research process, which will slow down research. Let's say, I'll get off my soapbox now. For me, the really important thing of changing research culture, and you're basically changing research culture in terms of what you want to do is you want to open up the research process, and you want to go from much younger me who didn't know about open research and open software practices, and you want to kind of inspire the next generation to not even think about this. So, in 10 years' time, hopefully, a talk like this isn't needed because it's just something that everybody does. And there's lots of ways of changing culture. You can change culture by leading by example. Fantastic. And I'm really grateful to the RSE community for teaching me, the ways that they have. You can also change culture by rewarding good practices, and that's something that's really important. We're all under pressure as academics to publish, to do good science, to do good research, and we want to be rewarded for the efforts that we do. And you know, we work within a university, so it's kind of relevant to do it within a university structure. So I wanted to just really quickly mention the research assessment framework, which is nobody's favourite topic of conversation, but we'll go with it. So the research excellence framework, its purpose is to assess world-class research. So I should say it's just in the UK. And what you do as an institution is you submit outputs from the people working within your institution. They change the rules every single year, so I'm not going to try and summarise them. But basically what you do is you, as an academic, you submit the papers you think your best papers or your best research outputs. And Simon Hetrick, who's co-director of the Software Sustainability Institute, has this kind of, so he's been kind of very instrumental in terms of pushing for recognition of the research software as a career path and the importance of software and research. So SSI did a survey a couple of years ago and they asked researchers whether software was important for their research. Nearly 70% said that software was essential for their research. So this is a tool that 70% of researchers could not do their research without. Yet in terms of REF, what people are submitting is people are submitting papers. You can submit software to REF, but very few people do. So this plot here shows the number of publications submitted to REF and the number of non-publications. And so this is 2008, 2014 and 2021. You can see that the fraction of outputs submitted to REF that are not publications is actually falling. So people, although academics and departments, you know, as an academic, it's not your choice exactly what gets submitted, although departments can submit software to REF, and by submitting it to REF you really recognise the importance of software because it's the language that universities understand. But people aren't, and there's lots of reasons why maybe people aren't. One of the reasons is it's very risky. REF is really, really important. You don't want to take a risk with it. So people are maybe nervous to try. But in the analysis that he's done, he's found that software in terms of grading stands up pretty well compared to the paper. So it's not the case that software is being downgraded. It is the case that very few universities are submitting software to REF. This is Simon's soapbox. So focus on publications is indicative of a research culture that overlooks many of the people that are vital to research. And that's the people that take the time to write the software, that open up the software practices, that have good data practice. These are the people that are making research better and more efficient and kind of really pushing us along the research, the knowledge journey, but aren't necessarily being recognised by that. So they've got a new little thing, which is the 5% manifesto, where they're asking universities to sign up to a manifesto where they promise to submit at least 5% of their outputs should not be publications. So that can be like museum artifacts or anything like that. It doesn't need to be software, but for us it tends to be software. Okay, I've got my 5-minute sign now. I'm going to be right on time. So basically, useful resources, there's loads. Turing Way, do check it out. Turing Way is really, really good. It's really interesting, and feel free to contribute to it as well. It's a community resource, and so it's written kind of by the community, for the community, in the way that this community does really, really well. They've got a new chapter coming out on environmental, like kind of low carbon computing, which should be really interesting. I don't know if any of you have been to a repo hack. Hey, Marion has. Thank you, Marion. They're fab. They're really good fun. So what you do is, it's kind of like a hackathon, but you're basically trying to reproduce data from a paper. So you can bring a paper along that you're trying to reproduce the data from. It's one of those things that by trying to reproduce from someone else's data, you realise what you can and can't, and what you shouldn't do, and what's not clear. So you do learn about what makes a paper more reproducible. Plus, they're quite fun. I need to do a wee plug for the Society of Research Software Engineering. So they have an annual conference. It's a really supportive community. I think people that are more academic and less research software engineering are sometimes a little bit put off by the name and the fact it's kind of proper research software engineers. But as a not proper research software engineer, I find it really, really welcoming and really, really useful. And finally, a little plug for my institution, Software Sustainability Institute. They run a fellowship program, which kind of gives you a little bit of money to create. It kind of gives you a little bit of money and a lot of support to kind of work in your own field. So the idea is that the fellows kind of embrace a kind of reproducible and open science within their own research domain. So they become ambassadors for open science. They run the collaborations workshop, which is a really fun, informal workshop. They also run the online software sustainability check, which is a tool that you can upload your software to, and it gives you kind of an automatic advice on whether your software is sustainable. So it kind of gives you some recommendations to work on as places to go. And so just finally, just in terms of summary, I know that covered a lot. It was a bit of a kind of a path through reproducibility, important. In my opinion, and this is increasingly evidenced by research, reproducibility and openness, the increased collaboration, the increased research impact, it's nice as a way of working. It's also better, more efficient science, which is all what we want to do. It's particularly important for climate research, which is still sadly controversial. Culture change is definitely happening. I think this has kind of forced me to kind of reflect on what's changed in the time that I've been in research, and loads has changed. There's lots of good tools, there's lots of people that are using those tools, but it does take a long time, especially for people that have worked for a long time and are a bit set in their ways. They're not used to kind of changing to a new tool. So this is, by adopting these practices, you can inspire others, and you do. People watch people doing research efficiently and think, oh, I could do that. And I think it's very under-recognised, but it's really, really important. You lead by example, you lead by doing, and other people will learn from that. And possibly you will never even know that other people have learned from that, but they will. Openness is important in terms of modelling. Models are really big, they're really complicated. They've all got we're less confident about. And by opening up that to saying exactly what we do, we can learn. We can learn from people's understanding, people's expectations, and that makes us build better models, which is what we want to do. And finally, openness is important for social justice. People need to be able to access data and access tools. If you want to start a new group in the global south somewhere, you're probably not going to have the resources to develop your own model, so you need to be able to access someone else's model. So reproducibility is really, really important in terms of the social justice as well. That's it.